They were 3 men alone on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. 3 keepers, 3 names carved into the logbook, and one December night in 1900, they vanished without a trace. No bodies, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. Only an empty lighthouse, its lamp cold, its table set for a meal that no one finished. More than a century later, the sea still whispers their names, but it offers no answers. From the moment it was built, the Flannan Isles lighthouse seemed less like a building and more like a defiance. A human challenge thrown at the wildest edge of the North Atlantic. Rising from Island Moor, the largest of the otherwise barren Flannan Isles, its whitewashed walls gleamed against a sky that could turn from blue to black in minutes. The seas here were not seas at all, but living creatures. They swelled, breathed, and roared, crashing against jagged basalt cliffs with the sound of cannon fire. The lighthouse stood alone. No nearby village, no sheltered harbor. Only this vertical outpost against the chaos. It had taken years of engineering ingenuity to anchor it to the rock. Its foundation drilled deep into stone that had resisted even the patient work of centuries of storms. When the waves rose high enough, they could still lash the base of the tower, shaking the lantern room above like the head of a match in the wind. Inside, life was a clockwork routine, but one conducted without an audience. 3 keepers lived in rotating shifts, 2 on duty at all times, 1 resting. And their job was to keep the light burning through every night, every squall, every winter gale. They were the unseen guardians of passing ships, their presence marked only by the steady, rhythmic flash of the lantern. A promise to sailors that someone was watching over them from the darkness. To work here was to live in 2 worlds. Inside, the air smelled of oil and warm stone. There was the ticking of the clock, the low hum of conversation over tea, and the scratch of pen against logbook paper. Outside, there was nothing but the endless churn of sea and sky, the wind clawing at the cliffs, the cries of seabirds that never seemed to stop. Those who came here learned quickly that the mind could play tricks. Shapes in the fog, voices in the wind, a feeling of being watched when no one was there. The Flannan Isles themselves carried a weight of mystery long before the lighthouse was built. In older times, shepherds from Lewis would ferry their flocks to graze here, but they never stayed overnight. Folklore claimed the Isles were inhabited by spirits, watchers who disapproved of strangers lingering too long. The tiny stone chapel on Island Moor, dedicated to St. Flannan, was said to be a place where one should enter humbly and leave quickly, lest the unseen inhabitants take offense. In December of 1900, as winter tightened its grip, the keepers stationed here would have known the dangers all too well. The lighthouse had been lit for just a year, and already the men assigned to it spoke of the place with a mixture of pride and wariness. They had been chosen for their reliability, men who could be trusted with the light through the worst the Atlantic could throw at them. The mainland was a distant smudge beyond the horizon, reachable only after hours of hard rowing in a supply boat, weather permitting. The relief ship, the Hebrides, visited once every 2 weeks to bring food, fuel, and mail, and to rotate one of the keepers home. In between, the men were cut off entirely. If trouble came, it would be their trouble alone. That month, the wind seemed to have a sharper edge. The days grew shorter, the sea restless. From the mainland, the lighthouse was still visible at night, a pinprick of light framed by the vast blackness. But few ships dared pass close in such weather. The keepers could only watch from the lantern room, the horizon empty but for the low line of winter clouds. Those who later investigated would try to piece together the quiet days before the storm. The logs told of regular duties: cleaning the lantern glass, winding the clockwork, hauling coal, noting the weather. Yet even before the final entries, there was something about the Flannan Isles that seemed to lean toward the uncanny. Locals claimed that birds gathered there in strange numbers, wheeling above the cliffs in patterns that no fisherman could explain. Others said the rock itself made sounds, deep, resonant groans when the swell hit the underwater caves just right. And so the lighthouse stood, bright-eyed against the darkness, its three keepers anonymous to the world beyond the island. No one on the mainland gave much thought to them, until the day came when their absence would shake the country. For now, though, the story begins in silence. The gulls wheeled. The waves battered the cliffs. The lamp turned slowly in its glass cage, casting its beam into the vast, indifferent night. And somewhere, deep beneath that steady rhythm, the island seemed to hold its breath. By the time the Flannan Isles lighthouse had been in operation for a year, the three men stationed there in December 1900 had settled into a rhythm that was part discipline, part survival. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant keeper, was only 28, but already seasoned in the work. Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper filling in for the regular man ashore, was older, a man known for his strength and quick temper. And James Ducat, the principal keeper, was the one everyone agreed could keep the place running no matter what the sea threw at them. They lived in a place that had no casual visitors. No curious tourists or wandering fishermen would appear unannounced. The geography itself kept the world away. This was not like tending a village lighthouse with a path and a pub down the road. Here, there was no road. There was no escape. The men had only each other, their duties, and the relentless company of the sea. Daily life followed the same patterns, almost to the minute. The light must be tended before sunset, the wicks trimmed, the clockwork wound. Lantern panes were polished until they shone like crystal. The weather was recorded in the log every few hours. Coal was hauled for the stove. The brass fittings shone under their cloths. It was the kind of work that could make a man feel safe in its predictability. Until it didn't. The isolation was not just physical, but psychological. For 14 days at a time, the keepers lived with no human voice but their own. The supply ship's visit was the only link to the outside world. And when it vanished over the horizon, the island seemed to slip further away from the map. Sometimes, in the long winter nights, the wind howled so fiercely that it swallowed all other sound. You could shout to a man standing beside you and see his lips moving but hear nothing. In such moments, the island felt like it belonged to something older and less forgiving than the human world. And yet, these were not men unused to the elements. They had worked through storms before, lashed the lantern room against the spray, carried out their routines with the stubbornness of those who knew that duty was their anchor. But in that final December, small details began to unsettle them. At least, if the later testimonies and the entries in the logbook were to be believed. In the weeks before the disappearance, weather along the Hebrides had been unpredictable, swinging from eerie calms to violent squalls. A sudden drop in barometric pressure could change a clear day into a howling tempest in minutes. For a lighthouse keeper, this meant constant vigilance. Eyes on the horizon, ears attuned to the pitch of the wind. The island itself offered no shelter from these changes. Waves could smash against the western face and send spray high enough to rattle the windows. Even on calm days, the deep boom of the Atlantic against the cliffs was a reminder that a misstep could mean vanishing in seconds. Those who had served here before spoke of an unspoken rule: never turn your back on the sea. That December, the three men tended to their work as always. The log entries were concise, factual, but as the days ticked by, they began to hint at something else, a tension that did not belong to routine. In one of the last recorded notes, Thomas Marshall mentioned severe winds and damage to the west landing, as though nature itself had reached up the cliff to tear at the edges of their refuge. Another line spoke of Duckett very quiet and MacArthur crying. A strange and unsettling image, given the hard-worn temperament of these men. What could shake them so? Some have argued that the note was misread, or that it reflected a passing moment of frustration, not fear. Others insist that in a place like the Flannans, fear can arrive like the tide. Silent at first, then rushing in before a man can step clear. Still, their days passed without visitors, without witnesses, without interruption. From the mainland, the lighthouse would have looked as it always did. Its beams sweeping across the waves, its white tower a lonely sentinel. No one watching from afar would have guessed that within those thick stone walls, the rhythm was already beginning to falter. And somewhere out beyond the horizon, a storm was gathering, the kind that could rearrange a man's understanding of what it meant to be alone. The final words written in the Flannan Isles Lighthouse logbook are, in many ways, the only voices the three missing men have left us. They are not shouts for help or letters to loved ones. They are simple, terse, and yet, when read now, they breathe with an unease that no official report could fully erase. The entries for the days leading up to their disappearance begin as one might expect. Wind directions, temperature readings, routine maintenance notes. But then, on December 12th, the tone shifts. The hand of Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, records severe winds, the likes I have never seen before in 20 years. The choice of words is strange. Marshall was young, with nowhere near 2 decades of lighthouse service. Was this exaggeration born of fear, or was he repeating the words of one of his older colleagues? The next line chills more than it explains. Duquette very quiet, MacArthur crying. Donald MacArthur was known as a tough, weathered man, more likely to curse at the sea than shed tears. For him to be weeping openly, something must have pressed far beyond the threshold of ordinary storms. On December 13th, the log notes, prayers said. This too is unusual. These were not men given to casual piety in their official duties. Such devotions were personal, kept apart from the formal records. The mere act of writing it down suggests something extraordinary was unfolding. And then comes December 15th. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. It is the last dated line in the book. After that, the pages are blank. The relief ship Hesperus was delayed by weather and could not make its scheduled visit on December 20th. When it finally approached the island on Boxing Day, Captain James Harvey noted something immediately wrong. No flag on the pole, no keepers waiting at the landing stage, no movement at all. The great light, which should have been visible for miles, was dark. Those who later studied the case would pore over the gap between the last log entry and the arrival of the Hesperus. In that time, what had happened to 3 capable men accustomed to storms, isolation, and the violent moods of the sea? Some argued that the logbook could have been altered or misread, that the crying and prayers were embellishments added after the fact. Others clung to the entries as a final breadcrumb trail, evidence of a slow-building crisis. Yet there is a peculiar stillness in the words themselves, as though the writer had accepted something that could not be fought. Imagine the lantern room on that final night. The great lens turning, its light sweeping the dark water. The wind perhaps quieter now. The sea no longer breaking over the western landing. And somewhere in the stone belly of the tower, 3 men sharing a silence they could not break, not with each other, and not with the world beyond the horizon. If the logbook tells the truth, they had already crossed an unseen threshold by the time its pages went blank. The final line, "God is over all," reads like both surrender and benediction. And when the Hesperus's crew stepped ashore, the silence of that surrender still hung in the air, waiting for someone to notice. The first man ashore from the Hesperus was Joseph Moore, a relief keeper who knew the Flannan Isles well. He had been here before in calmer weather, greeted by Duckett's nod, Marshall's quiet smile, and MacArthur's booming laugh. But as he stepped onto the West Landing that Boxing Day morning, the air felt wrong. Not the usual salt-laden sting of the Atlantic, not the familiar thud of waves on rock, but a stillness, the kind that presses against the skin. There was no one waiting to help him tie the ropes, no shouted greetings carried over the wind. The landing was empty, save for the crash of the swell far below. Moore began the climb toward the lighthouse, boots scraping the wet stone steps, his breath clouding in the cold air. Above him, the white tower stood unlit, the glass of the lantern room dull and lifeless. When he reached the door, it was closed but unlocked. Inside, the kitchen was warm from the last fire, but the fire itself had gone out. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen in the middle of an unremarkable hour. On the table sat plates with food half-eaten, chairs pushed back as if their occupants had risen in a hurry. One chair had been knocked slightly askew as though caught mid-turn. In the sleeping quarters, the beds were neatly made, except for one. Its sheets were rumpled, as though someone had just gotten up. The oilskins of 2 men hung on their pegs by the door. The third set was missing. Boots stood lined by the wall, save for one absent pair. These details were small, yet each one felt like a question. Moore moved to the storeroom, where supplies were stacked in precise rows. Nothing was missing. No signs of theft. No signs of violence. The logbook lay open on the desk, its last entry dated nearly 2 weeks earlier. The ink had not faded enough to feel old, but it carried the weight of a voice, now gone. By the time the rest of the Hesperus crew joined Moore inside, the mood had turned uneasy. They moved through each room slowly, as though expecting to find someone just around the corner. But the lighthouse remained silent. What unsettled them most was the sense of interruption, not abandonment. The keepers had not packed their belongings. They had not taken food or water. Their coats and boots, in December's raw Atlantic cold, were still hanging where they should have been worn. Even in the kitchen, the bread knife lay across the cutting board, a heel of bread beside it, as if someone had been slicing and then simply stopped. Later, some would speculate that the men were lured outside suddenly, perhaps to check damage during a storm surge, and swept away before they could return. But this theory stumbled over the same question. Why would experienced keepers leave their post together and without proper clothing in such dangerous conditions? It violated every rule of their profession. Moore could not shake the image of that table. 3 plates waiting for 3 men who would never sit there again. The air inside the lighthouse was stale. yet faintly carried the scent of cooked meat. Proof that whatever had happened was swift enough to leave dinner unfinished. When the crew of the Hesperus relit the lamp that night, its beam once again swept across the empty waters. But to Moore, the light felt different. Hollow, almost haunted. And far out beyond the black horizon, waves broke on invisible rocks, just as they had before. And just as they would long after the last keeper's hand had left the table untouched. When Joseph Moore and the crew of the Hesperus searched the island that day, they expected, at the very least, to find a trail. Something. A few scuffed marks in the soil, a line of boot prints in the mud, even a loose rope trailing from the rocks. But the ground gave them nothing. The rain had fallen in the days before, soaking the turf into a dark, pliable sponge that recorded every step. Yet there were no fresh impressions leading away from the lighthouse. Only the old, weather-worn paths remained, winding down to the landings on the east and west sides. On the west, the sea was calmer now, but the memory of its recent fury was carved into the rock. Twisted iron railings, a supply crane bent at an angle, ropes frayed to white fibers. The keepers had known that landing well. It was where supplies were hauled up from boats, where mooring lines were secured against the ocean's pull. Now, the crane's hook swung aimlessly in the wind, as though it had been left in mid-task. Heavy seaweed clung to the rock 20 feet above the normal high water mark, a sure sign that the ocean had recently risen higher than anyone would expect. Still, there should have been tracks, or at least some clue to the keeper's movements. The search party fanned out, checking every crevice and ledge, calling the men's names into the wind. Only the sea answered. No bodies washed against the rocks below, no clothing snagged on the jagged basalt. The sea caves beneath the cliff swallowed their voices and threw them back distorted, as though mocking the search. It was here that Moore felt the first heavy press of something beyond bad luck. An emptiness that was not just physical, but almost deliberate, as though the island itself had closed its hand around the truth. Official thinking leaned toward a plausible tragedy. One man goes out to secure equipment in heavy seas, another follows to help, and the third, breaking protocol, joins them. A single, monstrous wave could have swept them all away in seconds. The damage to the west landing fit the story well enough. But the absence of footprints, the untouched oil skins, and the half-eaten meal in the kitchen remained sharp points that would not bend to that explanation. It was MacArthur's missing coat that unsettled the Hesperus crew the most. December winds here could slice through wool like glass. To step outside without protective gear was to invite frostbite in minutes. Why would a man leave without it? And if he had gone in such a hurry, what had pulled him from the table with such urgency? By the time the searchers returned to the lighthouse, their boots had left the first new marks in the wet soil since the keepers vanished. They relit the lamp and prepared to leave, but the feeling among them was unanimous. The island had given them no answers because it had none to give, or perhaps because it chose to keep them. When they sailed away, the beam of the Flannan light followed them briefly before vanishing into the horizon mist. The Atlantic rolled beneath their hull as it always had, indifferent, unchanging. Somewhere beneath that gray expanse lay the truth of what had happened, if the sea had not already hidden it forever. In winter, the sea around the Flannan Isles is not just a body of water. It is a force with a will of its own. The Atlantic rolls in unbroken from the horizon, gathering its weight over thousands of miles before it strikes the Hebrides. Here, there are no sandy beaches to soften the blow. only cliffs like black teeth, waiting. The wind funnels through the gaps between the islands, twisting itself into sudden gales, while swells rise and fall like the breathing of something vast and restless. On a calm summer's day, you can stand at the western landing and look down to see the green, shifting patterns of the seaweed beds. But in a December storm, the ocean erases the world. Waves slam against the rock hard enough to make the ground tremble. The spray leaps upward in shimmering curtains, soaking anything within reach, even hundreds of feet above the waterline. To walk here, then, is to walk on the edge of a living trap. Those who knew the Flannans spoke of rogue waves, giants that rose without warning, walls of water that seemed to appear from nowhere. Mariners feared them not only for their size, but for their speed. One moment you were safe. The next, you were looking up into a green-black wall streaked with foam, higher than the mast of your ship. Scientists would later confirm their existence. But in 1900, they were still half legend, half nightmare. It was easy for the official report to imagine the scenario. One keeper sees damage at the west landing, perhaps the iron railings bent, or a mooring line threatening to snap. He goes down to secure it. Another man joins him, perhaps carrying tools or rope. The third, looking from the lighthouse, notices the danger and rushes down as well. And then, in a single instant, the ocean rises. A surge like a moving cliff. A roar so loud it swallows all shouts. When the wave recedes, the landing is empty. The tools lie where they fell. The wind carries away the last echoes of their voices. Above, the lighthouse stands untouched, blind in the storm. But even this vivid imagining leaves questions hanging like mist over the rocks. Why were 2 sets of oilskins still hanging by the door? Why did the logbooks speak of calm on the very day they were believed to have vanished? And why did no bodies return to the island in the days that followed, as the sea so often returns what it has taken? For those who have walked the cliffs, the danger is undeniable. The edge crumbles underfoot. The sea pulls downward, relentless. And yet there is something in the story of the 3 men that feels too precise, too final, to be only the work of chance. The wave theory may explain their absence, but it cannot explain the lingering sense that the island itself had closed in, and the ocean had been merely its instrument. When the storms pass, the Flannan Isles can look almost gentle under the pale winter sun. But the men who lived there knew better. Beauty was only the mask the sea wore between attacks. And if the island did take them, it did so with the cold, methodical patience of a predator that has all eternity to wait, long before the lighthouse was built. The people of Lewis and the other outer Hebrides whispered that the Flannan Isles did not belong entirely to the living. Fishermen avoided landing there unless they had no choice. Shepherds brought their flocks for summer grazing but left before dusk, claiming that the night belonged to other, older occupants. Among the most enduring of these beliefs was the omen of the birds. The islands were home to great flocks of seabirds, gannets, puffins, fulmars, that wheeled and cried above the cliffs in their endless search for food. Normally their movements were dictated by wind and tide. But island lore said that if the birds began to circle in tight, unnatural spirals above a certain place, or if they gathered in great numbers on the ground and refused to fly, it meant a misfortune was close at hand. In the days before the keepers disappeared, fishermen working waters several miles off the Flannans reported something strange. The birds, they said, were flying in dense swarms above the highest point of Isle Moor, far from their usual feeding grounds. Some hovered directly above the lighthouse itself, their cries carrying faintly over the water even in strong wind. To the fishermen, it was a bad sign. The sea was full of such warnings if you knew how to read them. Fish vanishing from a certain inlet, seals leaving a familiar rock, birds moving as if chased by an invisible predator. When news of the disappearance broke, these same men recalled the sight with a shiver. Perhaps it had been coincidence, or perhaps the keepers, looking out from the lantern room, had seen the same strange circling and felt the weight of it without understanding why. Oral tradition in the Hebrides wove these bird omens into deeper superstition. Some said the souls of drowned sailors could take the form of seabirds, returning to haunt the places where they perished. Others claimed the birds were messengers for the sluagh, the restless dead, who traveled on the wind in search of new souls to carry away. It was not hard to imagine that, in the solitude of the lighthouse, with the cries echoing through the stone, the men might have begun to wonder whether the line between myth and reality was as firm as they had once believed. Rational voices dismissed these tales, pointing out that storms disrupt feeding patterns and drive birds inland or to higher perches. A sudden change in wind direction could have gathered them above the island by chance. But even these explanations carried a kind of unease. If the birds were fleeing the sea, what had they seen in its depths that made the sky the safer choice? When later visitors stood on the cliffs of Ilean Moor, they found it easy to imagine the scene. A gray morning, wind pushing against the windows, and outside, hundreds of birds spiraling in eerie unison, their wings whispering in the gusts. Inside, 3 men glance at each other, half amused, half unsettled, before returning to their duties. And yet, perhaps somewhere in the back of their minds, an old story stirred. In the end, whether the omen was real or not hardly matters. It was part of the island's long memory, another layer of the invisible atmosphere that wrapped itself around the keepers in their final days. And when the birds scattered, as they always did, the sky above the Flannan Isles returned to its usual emptiness, leaving behind a silence that would soon deepen into mystery. Among the fragments of testimony gathered after the disappearance, one stood out, not because it explained anything, but because it deepened the shadows around the case. A fisherman from Lewis, known for his steady hands and his reluctance to embellish a tale, claimed that in the week before the Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles, he had seen a ship. Not one of the regular trading vessels, nor a fishing boat from the Hebrides, but something different. Larger, older, its sails dark as if soaked through, even in clear weather. He had been returning home at dusk, the western sky still holding the last red of the sun, when the silhouette appeared between him and the Flannans. It moved slowly, unnaturally so, as though the wind that filled his own sails had no hold on it. The vessel kept a steady course parallel to the islands, close enough that he could make out its masts, but too far to see any crew. He thought at first it might be a foreign trader caught in an unfamiliar channel, yet there was something about it that made him hold back from approaching. In maritime tradition, the sight of a ship in distress demands aid. But there was no signal flag, no flare, no shouted hail across the water. The ship simply drifted. When he looked away for a moment, to adjust his lines, he later said, and looked back, the silhouette had faded into the gathering mist. Later, when the news of the missing keepers reached shore, he remembered the encounter with a tightening in his chest. Had the strange vessel anchored near the Flannans? Had it sent men ashore? Or had it been nothing more than a trick of the light on a weary sailor's eyes? Stories of phantom ships were as old as the sea itself. Sailors told of the Flying Dutchman, a doomed vessel fated to sail forever without making port, its appearance a harbinger of disaster. In the Hebrides, some spoke of the Quartear Namara, the sea wanderer, said to ferry souls from the islands on storm-dark nights. Rational men laughed, pointing out that mist and imagination can conjure sails from nothing. But those who had spent their lives on these waters knew better. Sometimes the sea shows you what is coming, whether you understand it or not. The fisherman never claimed the ship had anything to do with the disappearance. In fact, he told the investigators that he doubted himself even as he spoke. But he could not shake the memory of its silence. Ships, even when far off, make noise. The creak of rigging, the slap of waves against the hull, the occasional cry of a gull following in the hope of scraps. This one had been utterly quiet, as if it moved through a separate world. If the keepers saw it from their high perch in the lantern room, did they watch it with the same unease? Did it linger long enough to make them wonder why it was there at all? Or did they too look away for just a moment? Long enough for it to vanish? On a lonely rock in the Atlantic, surrounded by endless miles of shifting water, the line between real and unreal is thinner than most imagine. A ship appears where none should be, drifts without sound, and is gone. Perhaps it was only a shadow in the mist. Or perhaps it was something that never meant to be seen, passing through the story of the Flannan Isles just long enough to leave another unanswered question. Not everyone believed the Atlantic had taken the three keepers. From the earliest days after the disappearance, a small but persistent thread of rumor suggested that the men had not been victims at all, but architects of their own vanishing. The idea sounded outlandish against the official report, but it gained traction for one simple reason. The Flannan Isles were the perfect stage for an escape. Remote, isolated, accessible only by boat. If a man wanted to shed his name, leave behind debts, obligations, or a troubled past, there could be no better point of departure than a rock at the edge of the known world. Whispers began in the taverns of Stornoway and Ullapool. One version had Marshall carrying a private debt he could never repay, the kind that could bring dangerous men to your door. Another painted MacArthur as a man desperate to avoid a looming conscription into military service. Rumors of war were stirring in far-off corners of the empire. Ducat, the principal keeper, was said to have once worked for a shipping company that had suffered a suspicious cargo loss. Perhaps the past had come to collect. The theory imagined a visiting vessel. Maybe that dark-sailed phantom sighted by the fishermen, slipping in close to the island on a moonless night. The keepers could have signaled it from the lantern room, extinguished the light to avoid detection by other ships, and left together under cover of darkness. Once away from the Isles, they could scatter across the Atlantic world, Canada, America, South Africa. New names, new lives, their old identities swallowed by the sea. Skeptics countered with practicalities. The men had left behind most of their clothing, their wages, and the tools of their trade. There were no signs of a hurried packing, no notes to loved ones, and no confirmed sightings of them anywhere afterward. Even in 1900, disappearing completely was no easy feat. And why would three men with different backgrounds, no known shared troubles, all agree to vanish at once? Yet the story persisted because it had a certain narrative pull. The idea that the keepers had outwitted both the elements and the authorities. It was a tale of agency, not victimhood. And in a place where the official version felt cold and incomplete, people preferred the romance of escape. The most imaginative retellings turned the three men into spies, meeting a contact on the sea for some secret exchange. Others gave them criminal roles, smugglers perhaps, with a stash of contraband hidden in the sea caves beneath Islay and Moor. In these stories, their disappearance was not a tragedy, but a transaction. And yet, the lighthouse remained. The logbook remained. The half-eaten meal remained. Whatever plan such a theory required, they would have had to unfold with a precision that bordered on the impossible. A boat arriving in high seas, timing perfectly with a break in the weather, collecting 3 men without leaving any trace on shore. It was a story that fit better in novels than in the harsh, wet reality of the Hebrides. Still, the thought lingered. Maybe the ocean hadn't claimed the keepers at all. Maybe, somewhere in the wide world, 3 men once called to tend a lonely light had walked away from it, pulling their new coats tighter around themselves, careful not to look back. For sailors on the North Atlantic routes, the Flannan Isles light was more than a beacon. It was a promise. A white flash every 30 seconds, sweeping across the black water, told them exactly where they were, and that they had not yet reached the end of the world. Even in foul weather, even in the darkest nights of winter, the light had been there since the tower's completion in 1899, steady and unflinching. So when passing ships in mid-December 1900 noted its absence, the silence was visual as much as it was practical. No beam pierced the night. No glint on the horizon marked the boundary between safe navigation and hidden reef. The sea in those nights must have felt older, more dangerous, as if some ancient hazard had been set free again. Captain Holman of the steamer Archtor was among the first to record it. On December 15th, as his ship passed through the channel east of Lewis, the weather was overcast, but calm enough to see for miles. The Flannan light should have cut through the gloom like a blade. Instead, there was nothing. Only the low shapes of the islands in silhouette against the dim sky. He made a note in the ship's log, but continued on, assuming the lamp was momentarily obscured by fog or that the keepers were tending to a temporary outage. Other ships reported the same in the following days, some noting poor visibility, others clear skies with no sign of the beam. It was the Maritime equivalent of hearing a clock stop ticking in an empty house. Easy to ignore for a moment, then impossible to forget once noticed. For mariners, an unlit lighthouse is not just an inconvenience. It's a rupture in the chain of trust between those at sea and those on shore. It means that something is wrong, either with the equipment or with the people who keep it alive. And on the Flannans, where the machinery was new and well maintained, the likelihood of mechanical failure was slim. When the Hesperus finally made her delayed approach on December 26th, Captain Harvey already carried a small unease. The sea was restless but navigable, the sky heavy with low clouds. He had expected to see the white gleam of the lantern as they closed the distance. Instead, the dark crown of the lighthouse loomed above the cliffs, unblinking. No flag flew from the mast. No figures moved along the landing stage. Even before they set foot on the island, the missing light had already written its own message. The chain was broken. The keepers were gone. Whatever had happened, it had happened quickly enough, or decisively enough, that no one had been able to relight the lamp. And in that gap of darkness, the Atlantic had been left to its own devices for more than 10 days. Ships passed in uneasy quiet, their crews glancing toward the black shape of the Flannans and wondering, not yet aloud, what it might mean when a light goes out and no one comes to relight it. The work of a lighthouse keeper is often imagined as a quiet life. Solitude, the company of the sea, the satisfaction of a necessary duty. But for those who lived it, the job was far from romantic. It demanded discipline under isolation, precision under monotony, and an unwavering presence in a place that could turn hostile in an instant. For the 3 men on the Flannan Isles in December 1900, the burden was not only physical, but mental. They woke and worked to the rhythm of the light, their days marked by the slow turn of the lantern and the steady beat of the clock. Their conversations, when they had them, circled the same narrow topics: weather, supplies, the next relief ship. Letters from home were rare and arrived already old, carrying news from a world that seemed to move on without them. Isolation does strange things to the mind. Even the most steadfast keepers spoke of feeling watched, not by any one person, but by the island itself. The wind could carry voices that weren't there, the sea could echo like footsteps in the stone, and the gull's cries could mimic a human scream just enough to make a man turn his head. In the endless repetition of duties, the smallest irregularity could feel like an omen. There was also the unspoken rule among keepers: never all leave the tower at once. One man must remain to tend the light and keep watch. It was not just protocol. It was a safety tether, a way to anchor sanity in the face of the unpredictable. Breaking that rule meant more than risking the lamp. It meant cutting the last cord to certainty. If the official theory was correct, that all 3 men left the tower together to face a sudden crisis, then something had to have overridden years of training and instinct. Was it the weight of their shared isolation that made them act as one, unwilling to leave a companion alone in danger? Or was it that the line between duty and survival blurred in the face of a force they could not name? Some historians have speculated that the strain of the post could have caused tempers to fray or judgment to slip. MacArthur, the temporary keeper, had a reputation for a fiery temperament. Perhaps an argument drew them outside. Others suggest that the bond between the men was stronger than the rules, that friendship, rather than recklessness, led them all to the same place at the same moment. The lighthouse service chose its men carefully, weeding out those who showed signs of instability. But no examination could account for the weight of the weeks, the darkness of the winters, or the sense that the mainland was more concept than reality. On the Flannan Isles, the world narrowed to the size of a rocky outcrop in the Atlantic, and every problem became magnified by the walls that contained it. In that narrowing of the world, decisions could be made in seconds that would seem unthinkable elsewhere. And in the case of the 3 keepers, it may be that the very qualities that made them reliable, their loyalty to one another, their sense of duty, were the same that led them out into the teeth of the sea together. The cliffs of Isle-on-Moor are not passive walls of stone. They are the broken edges of an ancient volcanic plateau, carved over millions of years by the most relentless sculptor in existence, the Atlantic Ocean. From a distance, they seem immovable, eternal. Up close, you can see the slow collapse in progress. Rock faces split by frost, ledges sheared away by the weight of water, whole slabs tilting toward the sea as though drawn by some invisible gravity. Below the surface lies a labyrinth of sea caves, their mouths hidden beneath the swell. At high tide, the waves surge deep into them, compressing the air until it bursts out in booming exhalations that can be heard hundreds of feet above. Fishermen call these sea guns. A single shot can rattle the bones of the island, shaking loose rocks and sending spray in sudden geysers over the landings. In storms, the effect is magnified. The ocean doesn't just attack from without, it detonates from within. Oceanographers studying the Hebrides have long noted the peculiar violence of waves here. Swells approach from multiple directions, colliding at angles that double or triple their combined height. The west landing of the Flannans faces directly into this chaos. Measurements taken decades later showed that storm surges could fling water and anything caught in it 20 or 30 meters above normal high tide. A man standing too close to the edge might be gone before he even registered the danger. The damage found after the keepers vanished fit this pattern. Bent railings, a twisted crane, ropes frayed to nothing. The official report pointed to this as proof that a massive wave had struck, dragging the men into the sea. But the Atlantic here is not content with taking. It also hides. The cold temperature, the depth of nearby channels, and the constant churning mean that bodies lost in these waters are rarely returned. Some islanders believe the sea remembers every life it has taken. Not in any conscious, vengeful way, but in the way a place holds an imprint. They speak of certain coves where the air feels heavier, where the cries of birds seem sharper, as though echoing something that happened long ago. The west landing of Flannan Isles, with its slick, wave-polished steps, has become such a place in their telling. From a scientific standpoint, the memory of the sea is written in its patterns. The same swells that struck in 1900 have struck before and will strike again. The same underwater geography that funneled the waves toward the landing that December still lies in wait. In that sense, the ocean doesn't forget. It simply repeats. And yet, standing on those rocks, it is difficult not to feel that repetition as something deliberate. The rhythm of the waves is too measured, the pauses between strikes too watchful. You begin to understand why those who live by the sea give it human traits: patience, hunger, even malice. The Flannan Isles are not a place where the past lies quietly. The sea still moves as it did on the day the keepers vanished, as if rehearsing the moment again and again, waiting for the next time it will be called to act. Years after the disappearance, the lighthouse on Flannan Isles continued its work, tended by new keepers who took the same oath, followed the same routines, and faced the same isolation. But the stories they brought back to the mainland were not the ones found in official reports. They spoke in low voices, usually over a drink, often prefaced with a disclaimer. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, but the fog was a frequent visitor to the Flannans. It could roll in without warning, swallowing the sea, the cliffs, even the top of the lighthouse. At such times, sound carried strangely, sometimes farther than it should, sometimes not at all. New keepers claimed that in the deepest fog, they would hear voices calling from somewhere beyond the rocks. Not the cries of gulls, not the low moan of the wind, but human voices. Some swore the voices called names: Ducat, Marshall, MacArthur, always those names. At first, they thought it might be a trick of the mind, a subconscious echo of the case that had made the island infamous. But the sound was so distinct, so measured, that a few claimed to have called back, only to hear nothing in reply. On certain nights, the voices seemed to be accompanied by faint footsteps, the kind that would fall softly on the damp stone of the path to the landing. One keeper, writing in his private journal, described hearing the sound of boots crunching gravel just outside the door. When he opened it, there was only the pale wall of fog and the steady pulse of the light above. Visitors, too, spoke of strange impressions. Crew members from relief ships reported seeing movement at the windows before they docked, as though someone were looking out to greet them, only to find the lighthouse empty when they climbed the stairs. Others spoke of a feeling as tangible as a change in the weather, that they were being watched from just beyond the edge of sight. Folklore rose quickly to fill the gap between fact and explanation. The locals said the island was holding on to the men, that the sea had not fully claimed them. Perhaps, in some way, they were still walking their watch, keeping to their duties long after their bodies were gone. Skeptics dismissed the stories as symptoms of isolation. The human mind is finely tuned to hear patterns in noise, to find familiarity in chaos. Fog distorts sound. It's easy to mistake the call of a bird or the slap of a wave for something else. And yet, these explanations did little to comfort those who had heard the names with their own ears. In the end, the echoes in the fog became part of the island's identity. One more layer of mystery to a place already thick with it. Whether they were tricks of wind and stone or something stranger lingering in the mist, they served as a reminder. The Flannan Isles were not finished telling their story. And perhaps they never would be. When the investigation concluded, it came not with revelation, but with paperwork. The Northern Lighthouse Board's official report, issued in early 1901, read like a tidy knot tied over a frayed rope. Its conclusion was straightforward. The 3 keepers had been swept to their deaths by an extraordinarily large sea while attending to storm damage at the West Landing. It was, they wrote, the most probable and most reasonable explanation. The report cited the physical evidence: bent railings, a damaged crane, ropes torn from their fastenings, and seaweed clinging far above the normal tide line. It noted that one set of oilskins was missing, implying that at least one man had gone outside to investigate. The others, it reasoned, likely followed to assist, breaking protocol, but not impossibly so in the face of imminent danger. Then came the wave, and the men were gone. On paper, the theory fit neatly. It matched the damaged landing, the treacherous seas, the absence of bodies. It closed the file without invoking superstition, conspiracy, or the supernatural. The board stamped it with its authority and moved on to other matters, as the machinery of officialdom always does. But outside the pages of the report, questions still pressed in like wind against a closed door. The log entries, especially the strange references to crying and prayers, were not mentioned. Neither was the fact that the storm damage appeared to have occurred several days before the men were last seen, making it possible that the West Landing had already been secured. There was no explanation for the untouched coats of 2 men, or for the absence of footprints despite wet ground. Some mariners accepted the report without hesitation. The sea was dangerous, and tragedies happened. Others found its simplicity unsatisfying. The Flannan Isles were not just another lighthouse. They were a place where stories nested in the rocks and rode the wind. The idea that 3 experienced keepers could be taken so cleanly, leaving behind a scene that felt staged in its stillness, was something the official seal could not make them believe. In taverns, the report was folded into conversation the way salt folds into water. Invisible, but still there. Some retold it as gospel. Others added their own footnotes about the phantom ship, the bird omens, the echoes in the fog, until the reasonable explanation dissolved into a dozen other possibilities. The Northern Lighthouse Board never reopened the case. The light continued to shine, tended by new hands. But each man who served on the Flannans knew the story, and each would have to decide for himself whether the official account was the whole truth, or just the part that could be written down. In the archives, the report still rests under its formal heading, the ink dark against yellowing paper. Its language is calm, measured, confident. But between its lines, there is space. Enough space for a rogue wave, a conspiracy, a haunting, or for something the Atlantic still refuses to give back. More than a century has passed since the Hesperus found the Flannan Isles lighthouse empty. The beam that failed to shine in December 1900 burns again now. Modern, automated, tireless, but it no longer needs the steady hands of keepers to tend it. The rooms where Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur once kept watch are silent. Their beds gone, their table bare. The smell of lamp oil has been replaced by the clean scent of salt and stone. Visitors to the island today, rare as they are, find a place both smaller and larger than they imagined. Smaller, because the living quarters are cramped, the paths few, the scale modest compared to the vastness of the legend. Larger, because the cliffs drop away into an ocean so wide and deep, it feels less like a view and more like standing at the edge of time. Standing at the west landing, you can still see the rusted stumps of the old railings, their twisted shapes softened by decades of wind and spray. The sea below breathes in its slow, endless rhythm, as though it remembers. On calm days, it is almost gentle, lapping at the rocks with the innocence of something that could never harm. But when the wind rises, the Atlantic shows its old face, and you understand how quickly calm can turn to catastrophe. The story of the three missing keepers lives on not because it was solved, but because it wasn't. Every theory, rogue wave, secret flight, supernatural taking, leaves some part of the puzzle unsatisfied. Each visitor walks away carrying a different answer, or none at all. And in this way, the Flannan Isles have kept their hold on us, as surely as they may have kept their last watchmen. If you arrive on a clear night, you can see the new light sweeping across the water, as steady as its predecessor. Ships still pass, glancing toward it in silent acknowledgement, just as they did in 1900. Somewhere out there, a sailor might wonder what it was like to live in that tower through the winter storms, to hear the wind in the stone, to eat at that table and never finish the meal. The truth may be gone, taken into the deep, scattered in the tides, dissolved in the salt air. But the absence left behind has its own kind of weight, and it is this absence that endures. The light burns on, and yet the darkness in the story remains. And perhaps that is the final role of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Not only to warn ships away from the rocks, but to remind us of the things we can never fully know. The beam reaches out across the Atlantic, a narrow thread binding land to sea, past to present. But beyond its reach, the ocean keeps its counsel, and the island keeps its silence. In the end, 3 men vanished, and the world kept turning. But in the minds of those who hear their story, the lamp is still cold, the table still set, and the wind still carries the echo of voices that no storm could drown.